systems, and that's kind of like the cosmolocalists. So I would like to see a kind of elite, of these people who know how to use these systems, who know how to build this infrastructure of coordination, but be at the service of this cosmolocal transition.
Hi, my name is Dave, and this is the Light Forest Podcast, a journey of exploration to bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. In Season 0, join me for conversations with changemakers from around the world as we dive deep into areas such as Asian philosophy, indigenous knowledge, regenerative economics, spirituality, and more, searching for the interconnected roots to the many crises engulfing our planet, from war and digital technology governance to climate and health. Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the Light Forest Podcast. I'm your host, Dave, and I'm super delighted that you could join. So, in this episode, we're going to jump back into our conversation with Michel Bauwens. So, this is part 2 of the conversation. If you haven't heard that, I recommend jumping back to that. We started out the conversation talking about Michel Bauwens' vision of cosmolocalism, which is a translocal view of both global and both local at the same time, and a view that goes beyond markets and states as the main institutions of our world and looks to something new, something that's more common-centric, something that is less extractive and less based on violence and fear. So in this conversation, we dive a bit deeper into why Michel believes that the crypto world, and by crypto here, I'm talking about Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other decentralized networks, on top of which the so-called Web3 or the decentralized web is being built on top of. And Michel believes that crypto has an interesting role to play in the restructuring of our world and creating the infrastructure for new institutions that are outside this market and state framework. He has a really interesting sort of macro view on crypto as a class of people with historical examples that are really interesting to listen to. So I'm going to keep this intro very short, but I just wanted to highlight that one is Michel's role in this crypto space. So Michel is a funded researcher with the Chinese Global Commons, or the GCC, which is a global collective of Chinese crypto professionals who are looking to promote and boost public goods and promote and boost Chinese Web3 participation in these activities. So he has first-hand experience and knowledge. He's also, and particularly pop-up cities, which is a new phenomenon that started with a pop-up city called Zuzalu last year. And this idea of building a community that comes together for about 30 days to 45 days and co-lives and co-works together. And so Michel he was part of Zuzalu. He's also been part of a few others, such as Edge Esmeralda. And so he brings in his perspective, which, starts many decades before crypto even existed, and brings that into these crypto worlds. And he is playing a role in helping educate, helping teach civilization history. And so I think he has a real first-hand view of the kinds of cultures, the kinds of ideologies, and the kinds of views that are being displayed in these spaces. And here, I think also I like to highlight that, the crypto world itself is pretty large and there are many different tribes. I think the kinds of spaces that Michel operates, and I include myself as well, are largely, the minority, spaces that are interested in public goods, interested in themes of regeneration, and, these are in some ways cultural leaders, but they're still niche, small spaces. The crypto world itself includes several degenerative behavior, destructive, extractive behavior. Trading itself is still, I think, by most metrics, more than 90% of the crypto space and the crypto market. So I just want to bring that into perspective. If you are familiar with crypto and you'll be well aware of this, and so if you're not, I think this is important to keep in mind. With that, I think this conversation looks into crypto as the role that crypto can play with a very macro view. And we look also at the ideas of values and belief systems and the need for a new kind of consciousness that we've never really had before if we want to really build this cosmolocal world. And finally, I would say nearly half of this conversation also goes into Michel's own background, which is very, very, very fascinating. He has, played a role in many different ideologies, spaces, and a lot of that has now informed the work he's doing today, the perspectives he has today. So I highly recommend listening to that as well to learn more about Michel's own background and how he's made the kinds of decisions that have helped him find more joy and helped him find work that really resonates with his being. So, with that, I'm going to leave you with the conversation. Many points or layers that we could run through. Maybe the one to touch on what you just described, which is, we have this degradation of the commons, the physical commons. And now with the sort of digital commons, you're saying we have this opportunity. And, you highlighted the role that crypto is playing, perhaps in creating sort of new forms of organization and coordination. So how do you feel? I mean, you talked about the techno-feudalism, concept, and this idea that while we do have this infinite information resource that's growing and growing, it's increasingly being captured with extraction by the large, big tech, the large multinationals, and now, governments as well are coming together in some form of coordinated techno capitalism towards, maintaining control and extracting economic value or extracting control in other forms. And of course, now with the generative AI evolution, we have even more added sort of incentive now for systems and platforms to be able to move in this fashion. So for me, when I see this, it feels challenging to imagine this paradigm shift to this third attractor, that you alluded to. And perhaps the question that then arises is almost, and this is, I think, a big motivation behind Light Forest and the sort of the thinking that I'm maybe trying to bring light to, which is, we have different layers of seeing. We have systems and we have institutions, but perhaps the most upstream from that, the most fundamental, is the layer of belief systems and thoughts and values.
Mm.
And here we have this wonderful interplay where it's the systems that have the monopoly, right, in setting the values and the belief systems. All of us, we grow up in the systems that we're born in. And so even crypto and the technology that we're talking about are ultimately still formed within this political space, within this sociological space, where consumerism, where the sort of extractive behavior is almost seen now as part of our nature and part of the way we
Yes.
think and act and believe. So how do we yeah how do you think about then this shift or this transition where perhaps we have this
Yes.
technological change, but then we this sort of
Yeah.
layer of being
So
and
that's
thinking.
that's a very complicated issue, and I don't claim I have a full answer to this, but let me offer you a few threads of thinking about this, right? Um, so think about are you aware of this term, the eggshell age, right? So this is from Carl Jaspers, and he noticed that around 600 BC, there was like a really convergent number of changes across the world. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Greek philosophy, the Hebrew prophets. So they seem to be coming up, I mean, more or less simultaneously, over different several hundred years. But so there is a book which I think is called The Green History of Religion, right? And it says that there was actually a climate disruption coupled with, the so the way I see it is you have, a fairly peaceful social order that is like in between horticulture and agriculture, right? Because you see, for example, the Harappan civilization and Minoan civilization, they don't have walls, right? That means they weren't afraid, not of neighbors and not of their own people. Um, and then they get destroyed. And so, what this is speculative, but I think there was a climate disruption. And suddenly, the people outside, the nomads, which could no longer have food, said, well, the goodies are there. So we're just going to take it, right? And so this created this whole dynamic between civilization and nomads, right? Which was like this continuous civilization grows, descends. When it's weak, nomads come in and take over the civilization. They become the new civilization. The Mongols, the Manchus in China, the Arabs in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, the Germans in Southern Europe. And um, and it was pure power. Like, I take you over and you listen to me and you work for me as a slave or whatever, right? So I see the actual religions as a reaction to this kind of pure power. So we need to recreate a new form of community within civilization because otherwise, it's too unstable. And so that created a new form of consciousness, ethical consciousness. So I'm no longer friendly with you just because you're my uncle, and I hate people who, that I don't know 1,000 kilometers away. Like some indigenous tribes, they call themselves humans, right? And they include the animals in their environment as humans, but they consider the other tribes as non-human. Um, so this kind of so kinship is nice, but it's the same hormone that dictates lactation is also you want to protect your tribe and your family, right? It has both sides. And so we needed to invent a new form of consciousness so I could be friendly with you, whom I don't know, but we are interacting the city together. And maybe I'm a trader and I'm traveling the empire and I can trust you because we believe and we fear the same God. So that's kind of the general idea of the Axel Age was, it was a popular revolt, but then created some compromise and that created the basis for the what people call higher civilizations that that were had more internal rules, right? Because a warrior, he's gonna kill and rape, but if he does that inside, that's that doesn't make for a very nice uh, community, right? So anyway, so I think this shows you that it happened before, right? A massive change in consciousness. Of course, it took time and it was chaotic, and I imagine that will happen, need to happen again, because we have created this kind of human being, where we think we're individuals and we don't depend on nothing. And and libertarians believe we don't need a state, and we can just make agreements with each other. But what I notice is they live in countries with strong states. They don't go to they don't go to Haiti and Somalia. They come to Thailand, and I think if we reach a situation where we will see and experience that we cannot survive on our own, right? Without new type of collective structures, that will push us to change. So that's the long point I wanted to make.
You've been spending
Yeah.
a lot of time within crypto communities over the last year or so. The Zuzalu and other pop-up cities that are emerging across the world, really. And you've been being there, playing a role in sharing your work and research and interacting with some of the what you would call the best and brightest, at least from a leadership or vision perspective. Um, how are you seeing the kinds of worldviews and the kind of consciousness, if you say, that can lead both the
Well, I
tech
have
with
mixed feelings.
the consciousness?
Yes, I have mixed feelings about this. So so one of the things you can see when there is a civilizational transition and chaos is what's called exodus, right? So first of all, you have like pioneering. I call it anticipatory consciousness. People who see like, no, this is going nowhere. We better prepare. The prophets and not, but also people who leave and to become monks, or they go to the desert and they leave the cities. And then, because the system stops working very well, it will also expel a lot of people, right? And so there's dialectic between the two. So if you want to leave the city, where do you go? Oh wow, there's this monastery there, and they treat people better than this lord. So they go live around the monastery and farm. Uh, so there's a connection between like an exodus that is experimenting with new seed forms over time, get its act together, and so they learn from each other and they connect to each other. And so I think, for example, the end of Roman Empire, this is how it worked. So people will start leaving the cities, including monastics. And at the end of the Roman Empire, you see that the Roman elite invest in the monasteries. Why? Because they now have to listen to the Germans. They don't have the right to bear arms anymore. Only the German people can have arms. But they are the intellectuals. They are well educated. So they say, okay, let's fund a monastery so I can send my children there. And when I retire, I can live there and speak Latin and keep my culture. So I look at crypto a bit in a similar way. So a very big impulse is simply fleeing, right? It's let's do arbitrage with the nation states. We invent a kind of money that we can use everywhere amongst each other, right? And if Portugal collapses, we go to Greece. If Greece collapses, we'll go to Colombia, etc., etc. So and this is very explicit in some environments. There's like the nomad capitalist is exactly how they reason, and they compare countries and how much tax. So that's kind of like an exodus, right? But it's selfish. So that's the first level, and I think this is unsustainable because if you're seen as a parasite and things degrade, they'll come after you. That's what I think. So I think there's a second level. And the second level is connecting with the locals, right? Is saying, well, with all the skills I have as a, digital developers, I will insert myself in, regenerative projects at a local level and see how I can help them and, also make a living doing that, right? So you have the somewheres, those who are less educated, have less capacity to do this arbitrage. They're stuck, in their cultural region, and maybe they can go to the countryside, but they can't just go everywhere. Or they can, migrate, but then they have to give up everything, and maybe they're not treated well where they go, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then you have these kind of anywheres, right? The anywheres, they don't care where they are. But then you have the everywheres, and that's kind of like the cosmolocalists. So I would like to see a kind of elite, of these people who know how to use these systems, who know how to build this infrastructure of coordination, but be at the service of this cosmolocal transition, right? It's kind of like the guilds in the Middle Ages. And actually, some people already start using that language. Like Austin Wade Smith is fascinating articles about how to create these new types of institutions, and he says we have the bioregional guilds and the specialty guilds who are translocal. So very similar to my way of thinking. And so I think there is a minority, but not an insignificant minority of people within the cryptosphere which are doing this. they are trying to do this, and and I don't know if they're very efficient at doing it. I don't think they they have all the answers yet, but I think it's significant that they are trying to do this, right? It's completely different. And this new class of precarious workers that's highly educated, have has specific translocal capacities. They're really the crafts of the day, because they have their own computers, but they don't control the value circuit, right? And so that's what they're doing. What they're trying to create a world where they can prosper. So we invent writing, and that creates a writing class, and the writing class creates accounting and the alphabet, and creates a writing elite, which becomes the elite of society. Then we get printing, and that creates, and the bourgeoisie uses printing as a way to create corporations and double entry accounting, and it creates a world at their image. And I think now the crypto world is a similar phenomena. It's people who have this translocal capacity, and they're trying to create a value circuit that works for them and makes them relatively independent of the state and big corporations. And I think that's healthy. I don't think it's healthy that they become, a new exploitative elite. That wouldn't be healthy. But as part of the transition, I think that is, this kind of self-infrastructuring capacity beyond market and state. I think this is very positive in the end. And they've created a world where we do open source, right? Where 90% of the software is outside of the commodity form. And now we're creating crypto. Yeah, of course, that was more in the commodity form, but now we're creating public goods in crypto. We are co-creating our own commons outside of market and state. So I think this is all very interesting. I of course I choose the positive. I look at the seed forms, and I don't complain about, oh, it's a minority, and things are not perfect. No, I think, like, how can we make this better and stronger, and and evolve faster? I'm not sure we're gonna succeed, but I think this is the way that reality is showing us, right? I don't think I'm inventing this. I think that this is real. I think that I see these patterns, and maybe some people see these patterns better than others, but I think they're real. I don't think I'm inventing this. I think this is like, you know, uh, a reasonable interpretation of the potential for change in the current reality.
Well, I certainly resonate with you on the finding the positive or seeing the positive side, and how can we make it better. I think that's definitely the sort of the impetus for Light Forest as well, of seeing or meeting systems where they're at, and then trying to incrementally or even on a large scale change that or improve it. And perhaps what was coming to my mind as you were sort of explaining how what you have open source and you have the tools and you have this new technology, that's forming outside of the traditional market state. And then perhaps you're saying is that you perhaps then there's space for some sort of guilds, or the monks example that you brought up earlier, of sort of you need this sort of
Yeah,
stewarding where you have these coders or the creators, and their genius lies in the creation of these tools and the creation of the means for production or means for coordination. Yet you have, on another layer, you need this level of stewardship. And our current institutions, and that's certainly a starting point for my own exploration, is our current institutions are not fit for part. They're not fit to do the stewarding, and in many cases they see perhaps as this new emergence as a threat to their current system and their current status
yeah.
quo. So
Th-
where do you see
They,
this
they're,
guild? Yeah, how do we
they
see
have a
this guild coming out?
predatory,
Yeah.
DNA. Yeah, they have a predatory DNA, and then they create the state to keep themselves in check. That's kind of like the traditional view, is you have, everybody is protecting their own interests, and that's new, right? This is a radical philosophical innovation that took root in the West. This idea that we are all rational,
Mm-hmm.
self-interested beings. And I think that's completely false. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying we don't have that. I'm saying that's just a part of who we are, right? And traditional societies, however exploitative they were, had much more of an insight into the communal logic that was needed at the same time. Um,
I know personally for me, I sometimes look at, Buddhist economics as a part of some of my exploration where they, connect the spiritual to the, to the economic, to see a lot of the economic activity of our time today as, efforts towards finding some sort of material sense of completion to fill a lack.
they,
That is
yeah,
fundamentally,
they
yeah.
kept, they kept the predatory classes in check. So that's the whole thing of, and this is, where Michael Hudson comes in. He has a book, but I forgot what it's called, but something with civilization. And so he's saying that there is a 1,000-year-old tension between the West and the East that predates capitalism. So in Greece is the first country in the world, ancient Greece, that put the rentier class in power, right? Lending money for usury, and that impoverished their own population. And there was a revolt which created democracy. So the West has a maritime, market-centric, antagonistic, democratic line. That never happened in the East. There were very sophisticated economics, in China, even 4,000 years BC, but the traders were never in charge. It was the mandarins, right? The mandarins kept the traders in the samurai kept the traders in a limit. So, for example, I think this is a very interesting example. Tokugawa Japan. So you have the 16th century civil war between all the warlords, and that creates a counterpower which is pure land Buddhism, and they control 1/3 of the land, and it's a commons. You can actually find the agreements and very harsh punishments if you over use the wood, because the wood was the main energy form, and the samurai had deforested Japan, right? So when the shogun wins, he he disarms the farmers. He takes over the land of the Pure Land Buddhists, but he keeps it as an imperial protectorate. So then he forces the warlords to come every 2 years to Edo, and they can't use wheels, so they have to hire people, and they have to spend their money in the capital. And then Zen takes over to pacify the warriors. So Zen is actually the warrior class of Buddhism. And then the ideology is samurai on top, manage and protect, the farmers next as producers, the artisans as transformers of the production, and the traders as just trading. I think I read somewhere in China they had like a similar ideology for a while, right? So this is very clearly an ideology, which keeps the extractive element in check. And for 2.5 centuries, Japan lived with a stable population in a stable environment. So it can be done.
Well, maybe here I often find some connections between, decentralization networks. We just talked about a lot of this, and perhaps finding a new kind of religious institution which is also decentralized, that doesn't take the traditional form of, one like the Roman Catholics, or even what we have see today as, Buddhist institutions.
Yes,
And perhaps this meeting of, technology itself being a mirror of our own sense of consciousness and our own sense of connection to each other. And perhaps here we see, and this is
right,
perhaps the imagination, that I like to take it in, is we see a sort of spirituality that, emerges, which, yeah, is less
right.
institution like, although fulfilling in the sense that it fulfills that need that people have to connect or to feel fulfilled, and that can happen at a much more, to use your words, cosmolocal level.
But one element has to be present. One element has to be present for me, which is solidarity, right? So traditional religions had a vertical aspect, the relation to the deity, and interior development, depth and verticality. But it also had a very strong um, horizontal solidarity, right? 98% of people in the Christian West were members of fraternities. Only 2% fell out of the boat. So there was a very high level of self-organization and solidarity. And we lost that. We entrusted that to the state, and now that the state is declining, we, especially in the West, it's terrible. It's completely atomized, and people are panicking because who's going to help me? Well, I guess people like me who look like me, or something like that, right? Or let's go back to an old religion or an old nation state, ethnicity, whatever. So the identity formations are actually regressing, um, and that's very bad. But I think the commons is in a way a counter thing, right? Because as you work together on a common project that is translocal, you also expand your identity to beyond your locality. You can see, but what I don't see yet is how this then can interconnect to each other, right? But maybe crypto is kind of like a first example of how this could work, because actually there is some kind of crypto ideology, right? That people do have shared beliefs, and so I saw this very graphically when I went to Montenegro, Suzalu, Montenegro. So you have the Bitcoin creates the blockchain, then Ethereum creates a whole infrastructure around the blockchain, and they create this kind of self-organized pop-up events called Zuzalu. And I was sitting on a table, and there was a deep adaptationist, like a collapsist. Like it's too late, can't do anything about it. We have to think about going to the countryside and see how we survive in the chaos. I'm probably caricaturing it a bit, but anyway. Then an impact investor, which, if you want to be mean about it, a greenwasher. And then there was a climate denier. Oh, there's nothing going on, and we will find something, to decarbonize. Well, what are people worried about? We just continue the way we are doing, more technology, more business. So these three people were talking together peacefully on the same table. Why? This is my interpretation, because they were all building a common infrastructure would be good for all of them together, independently of their opinion on this particular topic. So they could put it between brackets, within that. And so I think that's what the commons can do, create this kind of transcendent impulse. It's like an immanent transcendence, right? The It's not a god object, but it's a social object that allows people to. And I think we will need both. So we will need, this kind of horizontal transcendence, like a long temporalities that we can project humanity in the long future, because now we are, in this presentism, like nobody believes in the future, so people don't want to have kids and mental health issues because they cannot project themselves in the future. And at the same time, we lost the vertical dimension, at least in the West. And yeah, we will need to find a new way, and I think we need both, right? So that's why we have people like John Vervaeke who talk about transcendental naturalism, right? Both matter and spirit are in evolution, and how can we be fully scientific and fully spiritual at the same time, which may not be possible in certain traditional religions. So a lot of people are searching, right? um,
And I think
like the people I work with, Sakristani, they just wrote a book called First Principles and First Values. Like how can we restart, like, but not like just believing, in a traditional credo, but re-establishing, from ourselves, how we are connected to nature and to other people. And anyway, I'm simplifying, but I think so. There's a lot of people, engaged in this kind of existential search.
yes, and I think that's what with Light Forest as well, and through this podcast of looking for the different ways that people are seeing the world, but also looking for the ways or the importance of the sort of connection, the shared connection that we all have. Or as I put it in the forest, as the shared connection to the forest, and a realization, that we are all part of this
Right.
larger entity. And I think that can come to that solidarity point that you brought up, right, of the importance for solidarity that goes beyond the traditional identity forms that traditionally have formed that solidarity, whether it's the nation state,
Yeah,
and perhaps with the cosmolocal world, you sort of allow a greater agency at the local level for these kinds of identities to emerge,
yeah,
yet a seeing of this global
yeah.
connection.
We need universalism and
Yeah.
differentialism, right, at the same time, right? We can't just say let's go back to localism, and then start fighting with other localists, because that's what people sometimes forget is that uh, you know tribes fought each other, cities fought each other. So an empire paradoxically brought
Hmm.
peace. It kind of pacifies the interior and then pushes the violence on the margins, right? But it actually, this has been calculated. It's less people die in empires than in tribes. Um, and so, localism alone is dangerous if we don't have also a reason to cooperate, right? So, one of the things that makes me very sad is when I see Gaza and I see some people say, Hamas is bad, so, it's normal what is happening now, or the opposite, you know. And where are the people who can say, like, they're all human beings and they shouldn't be killing each other? Um, Very few, I feel. Maybe I'm wrong, but and so I feel that abandoning universalism, under the pretext that Western universalism was, abused, and of course that is true. But universalism itself, as the idea that we're all human beings, all persons with dignity and respect, like if we give that up, it becomes group-based competition again, and that would be regressive.
Yes, I think the situation in Gaza probably is just another the latest one that's manifesting in this state of hyper separation and competition, and this idea that one state's dream is another state's nightmare. And so, how do you
Yeah,
have two dreams? These two dreams itself are not abundant. They are,
yeah,
extractive in that sense. And so,
right. They have a win-lose, metaphysics, and the for example, Danish Spangler says, we need multi-win,
mhm,
right? We need to eliminate win-lose games
exactly.
and design win-win games, right? So it becomes like a game theoretical approach as well, which I don't master that discipline, but that's kind of what we're trying to do with the commons, right? Is create like a metaphysics of abundance, right? It's like if everybody has an apple tree with fences and something happens and your apple tree dies, you're hungry. If you have apple trees without fences and you say, well, you tell your neighbors, if you need something, you can take it from me and you can take it from your neighbors, you relax
Hmm.
because there will always be enough apples somewhere in that ecosystem. And we created so I call market scarcity allocation, and I honor that this is a time-tested mechanism, but I think capitalism is a scarcity engineering mechanism. So it purposely destroys abundance to create scarcity so that they can have pricing. And then in every sector, they create scarcity that creates oligarchy, and so that's the thing that I think is really problematic. And so by creating commons-based institutions which can protect common assets, right? We can keep like a good bunch of society immune from that appropriation.
Yeah, when I hear you say that, I think of a book "Small is Beautiful" by E.F. Schumacher, who talks about the wisdom of
Yes,
permanence, and we must
yes,
study the economics of permanence as
yes.
a complete paradigm shift to our current economic systems that we have today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we try this regularly, right? In the 70s, definitely there was like a first wave of this kind of, paradigm shifting. Um, then we regressed again. We can build on that to go further. And of course, they didn't have the digital, so we need also to rethink in terms of the digital. So maybe that's one thing I want to say before we kind of wrap up is the idea. So this is a friend of mine, Mark Whitaker. He's working in Seoul, and he did a commodity ecology platform. So the idea is you have 130 plus commodities, and you can monitor their flows. So it's thermodynamic accounting. You have 850 plus bioregions, and they've been mapped out. You can combine them and send these to the smartphones, right? And so what you then create is context-based sustainability. Now, I don't think it will work on individual basis, but I think that entities, collective entities like corporations, cooperatives, cities, could start manage, the flows with thermodynamic awareness, right? Because now we believe prices do that, but prices don't do that. It doesn't work. So we need more than just prices to protect from real scarcity. I mean the destruction of stocks and capacity for natural renewal and all of that. So I don't believe basically in pure market solutions and pure state solutions. We will need this kind of fourth sector, mix, um, but where commons institutions are kind of like the guardians of the collective resources that we need to survive. And I don't think states nor markets can do that. Markets because they only think about, I mean, capitalism about growing their capital, and states because they only think about their own states and eventually their own people, right? There is no legal responsibility of states for the whole of the planet.
Yeah, and I find that to be a fascinating new area of exploration of like a new institution that comes in not as this global empire, which is perhaps maybe a darker interpretation of this global system,
Yeah,
but a sense of solidarity or a Gaia, to borrow from Asimov's Foundation series, where
mm,
it's this collective stewardship, where this shared seeing that we are all part of this shared biosphere and we all have a responsibility
yeah,
to steward this. Um, well, I think that's a beautiful note to sort of transition out of this conversation. There's so much that I think you've already shared and given. Um, Perhaps if I could just end on a note on perhaps sharing of your own journey. You've um, talked a little bit about transitions and changing paradigms and moving away from systems. I was wondering in your own life how you've experienced this and how you've seen
right.
shifts in your own
Well,
thinking lead to the kind of perhaps work that you do and
yeah,
lead to where you landed
I'll
today.
I'll give a short version of this because yeah, I'll give us a short version of this. So I was very unhappy as a child. My parents were working class, went to school until 13, but my mother was like functionally illiterate. And when they got married and got me, they were so poor. We didn't have a fridge, we didn't have a TV, and the roof was leaking. So 1 year and a half, I had asthmatic bronchitis, and my life was in danger. So I was taken away from my parents and put in these sanatoriums. And I have terrible memories of this, like having to eat my own vomit, being in a glass cage, having nails like this. I don't know too much about it anymore because, it was before I was 3. But I think that really traumatized me. And so my whole childhood was not happy. And I thought, nobody loves me. I had this kind of abandonment syndrome. Um, had a hard time, dealing with females when I was a teenager and all of that. Anyway, um, so at some point, I decided like, oh no, so my first reaction was to be a revolutionary, like this world sucks, we need to change it. And I was a Marxist and from 17 to 24. And, I had an accident, and nobody came. I stayed 3 months in the hospital and nobody came to visit me. And I said, what am I doing? Like, what kind of group is this that, you give your life, but when something happens to you, they're so obsessed with their own goals that they forget the human, right? And I said, well, okay. And then, of course, it was also not working. It was, the early 80s, Thatcher, Reagan, like, we're not moving in that direction. That seems clear. And so I thought, well, if I cannot do the revolution, you know, and I put all the change outside of me, like I blame education systems and capitalism and, and my parents or whatever, like, how can I change? So I need to do revolution in myself. And so I started a whole journey of, self-exploration. Um, you know, just for people who might find it interesting, I lived in a sex commune. I was with Osho, I was Rajneeshpuram.
We'll
I
have to
was
do
a
a separate
Templar,
episode on that part.
Rosicrucian. Yeah, we can do a separate episode. And so I did the Eastern path and then the Western. And I ended up reading 3 years the philosophical tradition of the West. And so I had the impression, like, okay, now I'm as fucked up. Sorry, I probably can say that word, as effed up as everybody else. And I think, okay, now I can create. I've done enough self work. I want to, and so I create, and then I did a period where I was very active, entrepreneurial, created to internet companies, started a magazine as editor in chief, did a 3 hour documentary on transhumanism. That was the 90s. But somehow, at the end of this period, I had this horrible year, 1997. I had a very passionate relationships with broke. I thought, that this would have been the woman of my life. I divorced just before. My mother died. My father died. My mother got Alzheimer. I discovered there were, you know, accounting irregularities in my company. And I fought with my intellectual guru, Ken Wilber. So everything kind of collapsed at the same time. And that, in a way, it's a blessing in disguise because, if one thing goes bad in your life and you can, find something else, you can continue. When everything goes wrong at the same time, I kind of like collapsed. And so here I bring in varieties of religious experience from William James, who talk about once born and twice born persons, right? So once born person is born in a fairly good family, fairly good time period, fairly good village, um, and so can build like a continuity between the generations, and feels loved, and but they're not gonna rock the boat. They're gonna be continuators of something that works for them. Some other people, and I think that's applies to me, is like there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with the operating system. And so you feel like a stranger. You don't belong. You're in this world but not of the world. This it's called the gnostic condition. But sometimes these people can have a transformative experience, and I think that I had that. So I think the result of this crisis, and so to kind of explain it, so I had pushed away my world-changing impulses because it didn't work, but it kind of left me empty and cynical, and you know, okay, I could live and have a family, but I wasn't like truly happy. And I said, I need to bring that back, but hopefully in a more balanced way. And so that's when I started the P2P Foundation. I healed myself. I did all kinds of things, like massage and meditation. But also I decided to read up on civilizational transitions because I wanted to know, like, what can I do? And out of this came the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. And so that's like 2005, 2018. And then I will be very short about it today. We can talk about another time. I got canceled. So I didn't accept woke culture, and I wasn't very subtle about it. I just couldn't accept it. When they tell you like you can't speak because you're white, I said, "What? Uh, How can you even say that?" Like, anyways, I won't go into it. But I didn't accept it, and I might have reacted differently, but I just like kept my, a rock against the storm, and I got cancelled, lost all my financing of three different NGOs, got blacklisted. Um, but in a way, this was useful as well. First of all, because if you do anything important in life, some people will hate and dislike you. And this is something I was avoiding. I was like a conflict avoiding personality. Um, I had my internal superego telling, oh, don't say this, don't say that because you will hurt people. I was always being super inclusive, anyway. And I decided, no, no, I have to be who I am. And, I'm left here. I'm probably more right wing there. That's it. I might be wrong, but I'm just gonna continue to say it. And so, in a way, I think it was useful to make me stronger, get more backbone. But the second thing is like, what do I do now? And because of COVID, and I couldn't do anything, externally, I said, I want to understand a lot more about human society and civilization. And so I started reading up systematically. I'm still doing this. It's been 5 years now, reading systematically all the macro historians and what other patterns they identified. How does the world change? Are they contradicting each other? If they contradict each other, does it fit maybe together in a higher unity or not? So I have all these. I read 90 minutes in the morning. I meditate about my reading another 30 minutes. I take notes about everything, and I try to always put my comments, ideas, and dynamics into this larger field. So that's where I am now. I and then last year things started picking up again. So I have two very interesting research projects that I get paid for. But I took a step back from the public. So I'm the problem, of course, with social media is it's very toxic, and it just makes you feel like. So I still do it, but 3 hours a day, which probably is too much, but anyway. So I do my curation, but I don't have ambitions to be everywhere. I work behind the scenes more than before. And I'm an advisor to people that try to change the world as well, but have better capacities to attract resources. Yeah, that's where I am right now. And always learning. So now I'm learning about the crypto world and Web3 and not never technically. I'm interested in the human dynamics, the governance, the property formats, and always thinking, where's this going? Is this successful? Is this working? Is this hype? Uh, and try to be empathic, in my learning. So, uh, for example, I was only aware of left-wing thinking. And I said, okay, well, that like a bunch of them are evolving in a direction which I don't like. So what's the other side saying, right? But not like just condemning them and say, "Oh, these are evil people." I want to know what they say, but like let's try to understand how they think from like the inside, right? Um, until I feel like, okay, I get it. I get what is motivating them, how they see the world. Then I can move to something else. But this is kind of, I think, the way I function. It's participant observation.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, the only thing that doesn't work for me is with the woke. I'm sorry, I have this reactive pattern because I felt attacked so violently, and the biggest thing for me is they didn't want to talk, right? So they condemn you, and he said, "Oh, well, let's talk." No, you're evil, and you can't talk, and so you feel like a non-person, like literally you don't exist anymore. And so I do have, unfortunately, some kind of emotional pattern, and but I also justify to myself. It's just like, like fascism, right? In the 30s. Would it be justified or not to be against them? I think yes. And I really think that this is on a similar level. It's the, René Girard, he talks about scapegoating mechanisms, right? And he said the difference between the extreme right and the extreme left, he said, is the extreme right, they want power. And if you're weak, you're bad. And so if you're weak, they kick you even more. Um, and then the opposite is, we're victims and everybody's oppressing me, and you're all oppressors and we want to kick you as an oppressor. So it's different, but at the same time there is like a similarity in the reactivity of these patterns where and at the danger of being a bit like self-serving, but I do think that one of the good things of some of people in my generation is we did a lot of self-work, right? So self-work means that there's a lot of projection that you can see. Not all of it. We're all projecting all the time. But there is a degree of, like, for example, I learned that if you really hate somebody, like at the individual level, it's probably because he or she is expressing a part of you that you don't accept inside yourself. Because otherwise, why would you get excited about it, right? You may not like them, but why do you get excited about it, right? So this is something that you learn through self-work and meditation and therapy. And my big fear is that we have generations of being so medicalized, and getting medications when they feel bad, that they have never felt the need to do that self work, and so the projection mechanism, really have no balance. And I think that is, I'm not saying it's happening on one side. I think it's happening across the spectrum, and so that we have to try to be integrative, right? So what's the relative truth of this position? What's the relative truth of this position? So I can find a lot of relative truth, in the identitarian positions. My problem is that they absolutize. And, and the same thing on the extreme right, you can see that, there's relative truth in some of these positions, but the problem is they absolutize, right? So that's the problem with radical extremes, is that you get a partial truth, which is like, takes so much space that you cannot see anything else. So you say, there's structural racism, or you say it's cultural, and nobody can say it's both. And I that's the way the position I would have. I would say, well, for sure there are structural elements in inequality, but also, sometimes cultures are not healthy for people's self-advancement. So it's also legitimate to talk about culture. Anyway, that's me.
No, that's great. I think some of these themes you just
So
mentioned.
I'm probably losing a lot of people who like the beginning of the talk, don't like the conclusion of it. But
No,
anyways,
I think
that's
yeah,
me.
this is wonderful interrelation of your journey to be in this world, and your journey of
Yeah,
finding some source of solidarity with yourself and with others around you, contributing to
yeah,
this journey for studying civilization history and being in a position now where you
yeah,
can see these trends and see these connections, and be part of this stewarding process towards a
yeah.
transition.
And and create smaller groups based on reciprocity and trust. I think that's kind of also a normal expression of these difficult times we're in. Where it's the world of the masses is toxic in a way. Mass formation. But you can create smaller groups where you have more time to create long-term trust, recognize each other's persons, and recognize and respect each other's differences. And we like a kind of group healing has to take place first, because before you can, because going out in the world as an individual without any solidarity, that's basically what I experienced. and I don't want to experience it again. So I'm now working with people like, yeah, I can be fairly confident that, you'll stick by me if something bad happens, and I'll do the same for you, right? We used to, especially in the West, like the state will do it. If I get sick, I get welfare. If I get employed, I get welfare. And as these systems are declining, like, who else is there? Nobody, because we've relied on the state so much, and that's, I guess, in some way, people in the global South, or whatever term you want to use for that, they never went so far, in destroying their own, like, family and clan, and so I can see that where I live, where my wife's family is amazing, like, really, the family is a commons. So I somebody will help me. I don't have to help that person directly, but they can count on me to help somebody else in the family when they get in trouble, right? And for me as a European, it's like,
Right.
wow,
Reciprocity is not
only
one to
child from
one.
two
Yeah.
only from no, it's not just one to one. And that's the difference between the gift economy, where you expect a return from a particular person or a group of people, and the commons, which is you exchange with the whole, right? People think they're the same. They're not the same. They're different relational dynamics. Gifting and coming are not the same. Like the Amish, when they do barn raising, right? Everybody helps to build the house of a young couple because they think it's good for the community that the couple has a house. And they will do that for every couple that forms within the community, no questions asked. But there's no direct, like, reciprocity required. You don't have to give me anything because I'm helping you making your house. But I expect that you will help later another young couple because you have been helped by the community, right? So that's commoning. It's a relation with a whole that transcends your individuality.
Lovely. Well, on that note, I think we'll end the conversation. I think many points we can continue touching base on, and I will link all the various sources you've shared, including to your own work and your own Substack, in the show notes. So for listeners, can find the various links to all the work you've mentioned, and we'll be able to look you up and find your newsletter as well. Thanks so much, Michelle, for this conversation. It's been lovely, and perhaps we'll do another round two on some of the many themes in the future.
Thank you, Dev. I really appreciate it, and I always appreciate you being here in Chiang Mai, and how you. I think your presence in the world is also very inspiring, and creates, like, really positive vibes around you.
Thank you. So that was the conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. There was a lot there, a lot to unpack, and I think we'll pick up some of these threads in future conversations that I have. Um, the links to many of the sources are in the show notes. And if you haven't subscribed already, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast and do share with a friend. Friend, any colleague that you think might be interested in these kinds of conversations and these kinds of themes. I think that really helps the podcast and helps us spread and find a bigger audience. So, with that, I'll leave you to it. Have a lovely, lovely week ahead, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.